There is a strange experiment that psychologists have quietly studied for decades, and almost no one talks about it in polite conversation. It goes like this. Take a person who is well-known, well-liked, constantly available, always replying, always present in every group chat, every gathering, every notification, then remove them completely for 7 days. No explanation, no warning, no trace, and watch what happens to the people around them. What you discover is not what you expect. You would think chaos follows. You would think people panic. People worry. People flood your phone with messages asking if you are okay, and for the first day or two, maybe they do. But then something else happens, something far more revealing about human nature, about relationships, about your own identity, and about the quiet lie you've been living inside without even noticing. The world does not stop, and that single realization, when it hits you, can either destroy you or completely rebuild you. Because here is the uncomfortable truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You have built an identity around being needed, around being seen, around being available. You answer every text within minutes because somewhere deep inside, silence feels like disappearing, and disappearing feels like dying. You show up to every event, every call, every obligation, not always because you want to, but because some part of you is terrified of what happens to your value in other people's eyes if you are not there. You have mistaken presence for worth, and that mistake is costing you more than you realize. So let me ask you something, and I want you to actually sit with this question instead of rushing past it the way you rush past everything else in your noisy, overstimulated life. What would happen if you disappeared for 7 days, not physically vanished into the woods with no phone, although we will get to that. I mean, truly disappeared. No replies, no updates, no check-ins, no performance, no proving, just silence. Would your friendships survive? Would your business survive? Would your relationships survive? And more importantly, more terrifyingly, would you survive without the constant feedback loop of being seen, validated, and needed? Most people have never asked themselves this question because they have never had to. Modern life does not allow for disappearance. It rewards constant visibility, constant noise, constant proof of existence. We have created a civilization where silence feels like failure, where stillness feels like falling behind, where the fear of being forgotten drives almost every decision we make. Even the decisions we tell ourselves are about ambition or love or connection. But underneath the ambition, underneath the business, underneath the endless scrolling and replying and showing up, there's a quiet, desperate whisper running through almost every human mind. If I stop, will anyone notice? And if they don't, what does that say about me? This is the fear that keeps you glued to your phone at midnight, refreshing an app for no reason. This is the fear that keeps you saying yes to plans you do not want to attend. This is the fear that keeps you working late, answering emails you should ignore, performing a version of yourself that never rests, because resting feels dangerously close to disappearing. And so you never test it. You never find out what would actually happen if you removed yourself completely, because some deep animal part of your brain believes that if you disappear even for a week, the world will simply move on without you. And that thought is unbearable. But here is what almost nobody tells you. That fear is not really about the world moving on. It is about who you would have to face if there was no one left to perform for. Because when you disappear, when the noise stops, when the phone stays dark and the calendar stays empty and no one is watching, you are left with exactly one person, yourself. And for many people, that is the most frightening reunion imaginable. Think about how rare true solitude has become. We are the most connected generation in human history and somehow also the loneliest. We have thousands of digital witnesses to our lives, yet almost no real relationship with our own minds. We have built entire identities out of external validation, like replies, invitations, opinions of coworkers, approval of family, admiration of strangers online. And we have quietly forgotten how to exist without an audience. Disappearing for 7 days breaks that illusion completely. It strips away every external mirror you use to define yourself and forces you to look at what remains. For some people, what remains is peace they didn't know existed. For others, what remains is a void so uncomfortable they cannot sit in a quiet room for more than 10 minutes without reaching for their phone like a drowning person reaching for air. Which one are you? You don't know yet, do you? And that not knowing should terrify you a little, because it means you have built your entire sense of self on a foundation you have never actually tested. Let's talk about what actually happens psychologically and socially when someone disappears for a week, not metaphorically, literally. No calls, no texts, no social media, no explanations given in advance. The first 24 hours are almost meaningless. People assume you're busy. Life continues exactly as normal, and this alone is uncomfortable for anyone paying close attention, because it reveals just how replaceable your daily presence actually is in the minds of others. Not because you don't matter, but because human attention is short, self-focused, and easily absorbed by immediate concerns. By day 2 or 3, something more interesting begins. A small percentage of people, usually far fewer than you'd expect, start to notice the silence. They reach out, maybe once, maybe twice. If you do not respond, most of them will not chase further, not because they don't care, but because chasing feels vulnerable, and most humans avoid vulnerability instinctively. This is where the first great lesson of disappearing reveals itself. The people who reach out more than once, who show real concern without demanding an explanation, who sit with the discomfort of not knowing rather than immediately giving up, are showing you something almost no other circumstance in life can reveal so clearly. They are showing you the actual depth of your relationships, stripped of performance, stripped of obligations, stripped of the social contracts that usually keep people responding out of habit rather than genuine care. You cannot fake this discovery through conversation. You cannot ask someone, do you actually care about me? And get an honest answer, because social politeness contaminates almost every direct question like that. But silence, real silence, sustained over days, bypasses the polite mask completely and reveals the truth underneath. And that truth is often not what you expected. Some people you assumed were close will vanish from the picture entirely, revealing that the relationship was built on convenience, not depth. Some people you barely noticed will surprise you completely, showing a level of concern and loyalty you never anticipated. This alone is worth the discomfort of disappearing. But it's only the beginning. Because while your relationships are being quietly tested and revealed on the outside, something even more significant is happening inside you. By day 3 or 4, most people who attempt real disengagement, no phone, no messaging, no performing, begin to experience something psychologists call identity withdrawal. It feels remarkably similar to substance withdrawal, restlessness, irritability, a strange hollow anxiety with no clear cause. This happens because your brain has been conditioned over years to associate constant connection with safety and constant validation with self-worth. When that supply is cut off, your nervous system does not know how to interpret the silence. It interprets it as threat. This is the exact moment most people quit the experiment. They convince themselves they need it elsewhere, that they have important responsibilities, that disappearing is irresponsible or selfish, and they log back in, not because circumstances demanded it, but because the discomfort of facing themselves became unbearable. But if you can survive past that point, something begins to shift. And this is where the story gets far more interesting than most people expect. Because what waits on the other side of that discomfort is not emptiness. It's clarity. But to understand why that clarity is so powerful and why so few people ever reach it, we need to go deeper into what silence actually does to the human brain, why history's greatest thinkers deliberately disappeared before their greatest decisions, and what happens in the exact moment your identity stops depending on being seen. There's a reason nearly every major spiritual and intellectual tradition in human history includes some version of the same ritual. The desert fathers of early Christianity walked into empty wilderness for 40 days. Buddha sat alone under a tree until something in him broke open and reformed. The Stoics practiced what Seneca called a rehearsal of poverty, deliberately withdrawing from comfort and company to test what they truly needed versus what they merely wanted. Even in more recent history, Nikola Tesla, Isaac Newton, Carl Jung, all of them retreated into deep isolation during their most transformative periods of thought. Jung literally built a stone tower away from civilization and would disappear there for weeks, calling it the place where he met himself honestly for the first time. This was not a coincidence, and it was not simply preference. These were people who understood something modern society has almost completely forgotten. Clarity does not live in noise. It lives in the space after the noise stops. Your brain, when constantly stimulated, operates in what neuroscientists call a reactive state. Every notification, every conversation, every scroll through a feed pulls your attention outward, forcing your mind to respond rather than reflect. Over time, this creates something called cognitive fragmentation, where your thoughts never fully complete themselves because they're constantly interrupted by new input. You felt this? That sense of finishing a day completely exhausted despite doing nothing physically demanding. That is not laziness. That is a mind that has been pulled in 50 directions without ever being allowed to settle into one. When you disappear, truly disappear, this reactive state has nowhere left to go. And for the first 2 or 3 days, this creates intense discomfort because your mind, starved of external stimulation, starts searching desperately for something to react to. This is why people who attempt digital silence often report an almost unbearable urge to check their phones for no logical reason. It's not that they're expecting anything important. It's that their nervous system has been trained like a lab animal pressing a lever to seek stimulation as a form of emotional regulation. But somewhere around day 4 or 5, if you resist that urge, something remarkable begins to happen inside the brain. The default mode network, the part responsible for self-reflection, memory integration, and long-term thinking, begins to activate more strongly. This is the same brain network responsible for those sudden flashes of insight you get in the shower or during a long walk or right before falling asleep. It only fully activates when external stimulation quiets down enough to let it work. This is why some of your best ideas never come while scrolling or socializing, but instead arrive in stillness. Silence is not empty. It's where your mind finally gets the chance to organize everything it's been collecting. Now apply this to 7 full days of disappearance, and you start to understand why so many historical breakthroughs occurred after periods of complete withdrawal. It wasn't magic, it was neurological space finally given room to breathe. But there's a psychological layer here that's even more important than the neuroscience, and it has to do with identity. Social psychologists have long studied something called the looking glass self, a concept describing how much of your identity is built not from internal truth, but from how you believe others perceive you. Most people, without realizing it, are constantly performing a version of themselves calibrated to the expected reactions of their audience, coworkers, family, social media followers, even strangers. This performance becomes so constant, so automatic, that people lose track of where the performance ends and the real self begins. Disappearing for 7 days interrupts this performance completely. There is no audience left to calibrate for, no one liking your posts, no one responding to your texts, no one reacting to your presence in real time. And for someone who has spent years, maybe decades, building identity through external reflection, this absence can feel like losing gravity. There's a reason so many people describe intense isolation, even short-term, as disorienting or even mildly frightening. It's not the silence itself that's terrifying. It's meeting a self that has not been shaped by an audience. This is where the real transformation begins, because once that performance drops away, even briefly, you're left facing a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Who are you when no one is watching? Not who do you want to be? Not who do you present yourself as? Who are you actually in the raw, unwitnessed quiet of your own mind? This question terrifies people because most have never had to answer it. Their entire sense of self has been built through interaction, reaction, and reflection from others. Remove the mirror and many people don't know what they're looking at. But here's the profound part. The people who do survive this confrontation, who sit with the discomfort instead of running from it, often describe the experience using strikingly similar language. They talk about a sense of returning to themselves, of remembering something they'd forgotten, of feeling for the first time in years like their thoughts were actually their own rather than a reaction to everyone else's expectations. This is not poetic exaggeration. It's a measurable psychological shift. Studies on solitude, particularly research led by psychologists studying voluntary isolation, show consistent patterns: initial anxiety and restlessness, followed by emotional processing, followed by what researchers describe as a marked increase in self-concept clarity, meaning people, after extended solitude, report a stronger, more stable sense of who they are and what they actually want, independent of outside influence. In simpler terms, disappearing doesn't just reveal the truth about your relationships, it reveals the truth about you. And this is where things get uncomfortable in a different way, because once you experience that clarity, once you feel what it's like to make a decision, form a thought, or simply exist without needing outside approval, you cannot easily unfeel it. It changes the way you see your normal life once you return. People who complete extended periods of intentional disappearance often report a strange grief when re-entering their old routines. Not because solitude was pleasant the whole time, much of it wasn't, but because they can suddenly see with painful clarity how much of their pre-disappearance life was built on performance rather than genuine desire. They see how many of their daily interactions were obligation, not connection. How many of their responsibilities were self-imposed pressure, not real necessity. How much of their personality, their opinions, their preferences were shaped by trying to fit into the expectations of people who, as it turns out, barely thought about them at all once the noise stopped. This is the real reason disappearing for 7 days is so unsettling to even consider. It's not the fear of the outside world falling apart without you. It's the fear of realizing how much of your inner world was built to please an audience that was never paying as much attention as you assumed. And once you see that clearly, you can never again live entirely on autopilot. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, a piece most people overlook entirely, and it might be the most important part of the entire experiment. It has to do with what happens not during the disappearance, but after you return, because the way people respond to your absence, and more importantly, the way you respond to their response, reveals something about power, self-worth, and emotional independence that most self-help advice completely misses. And that revelation is where this entire idea stops being just an interesting thought experiment and starts becoming a method for rebuilding your entire relationship with yourself. When you return after 7 days of true disappearance, something interesting happens that almost nobody prepares you for. You expect the world to greet you with questions, maybe even concern, perhaps a flood of messages demanding explanation. Instead, what usually happens is far quieter and far more revealing. Life simply continues. A few people mention they noticed you were quiet. A few ask if everything is okay, and the vast majority, barely register that you were gone at all. Not out of cruelty, not because they don't value you, but because human attention by nature is consumed by immediate personal concerns, not the absence of others. This moment right here is where most people make a critical mistake. They interpret this lack of dramatic reaction as proof that they don't matter, that their presence is forgettable, that they are, in some quiet sense, replaceable. And this interpretation can either wound you deeply or set you completely free, depending entirely on what you understood before you disappeared. Because here's the truth almost no one tells you. The world not falling apart without you is not evidence that you are unimportant. It is evidence that your worth was never supposed to be measured by how much chaos your absence creates. This is the exact belief you must dismantle if you want real emotional freedom. You have been taught subtly over years of cultural conditioning that being missed intensely equals being valued. that the more people panic without you, the more it proves your significance. But this is a dangerous, fragile way to measure self-worth because it means your value depends entirely on other people's emotional reactions you cannot control, predict, or rely on. The healthier truth, the one revealed only through actual disappearance, is this: genuine relationships do not require constant presence to remain strong, and your worth does not evaporate simply because the world continues moving in your absence. This realization is liberating in a way that's difficult to explain until you experience it directly. Because once you understand that the world can survive without your constant visibility, you stop performing out of fear and you start showing up out of choice. There is an enormous difference between the two. Performing out of fear looks like replying instantly because silence feels dangerous. It looks like saying yes to plans you don't want because declining feels like risking rejection. It looks like overworking, over-explaining, overextending yourself in relationships because some deep, unexamined part of you believes that if you ever stop giving, stop showing up, stop proving your usefulness, people will simply discard you. Showing up out of choice looks completely different. It looks like responding when you genuinely want to, not because obligation is whispering threats in your ear. It looks like saying no without guilt, because you understand that your value isn't determined by constant availability. It looks like resting without shame, working with intention instead of anxiety, and loving people without the exhausting need to constantly prove you deserve their attention. This shift from performance to authenticity is the single most valuable outcome of disappearing. And it cannot be taught through advice alone. It has to be experienced. You have to feel the silence. You have to sit with the discomfort of being unseen. You have to watch the world continue without collapsing and realize that this is not rejection. It's simply reality, one that was always true, but hidden beneath the noise you built around yourself to avoid facing it. There's a deeper layer to this too, something that touches directly on emotional intelligence and self-respect. When you stop needing constant external validation to feel secure, your relationships actually improve, not despite your newfound independence, but because of it. People are naturally drawn to those who possess a stable, self-contained sense of identity. Neediness, though rarely intentional, often pushes people away subtly because it creates pressure, obligation, and emotional heaviness in interactions. But someone who is calm, secure, and unafraid of solitude radiates a different kind of energy entirely, one that feels safe, grounded, and magnetic without even trying. This is why some of the most emotionally intelligent people you'll ever meet share one quiet trait in common. They are comfortable disappearing, not because they don't value connection, but because their sense of self doesn't collapse without it. They understand solitude not as punishment or loneliness, but as recalibration, a necessary return to their own center, a way of remembering who they are outside the roles they play for others. Think about how different your life would look if you approach relationships, work, and even social validation from this place of quiet self-assurance rather than constant anxious performance. Think about how much energy you would save if you stopped needing every message answered immediately, every event attended, every opinion validated by outside approval. This is not about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming whole enough that connection becomes a choice rather than a desperate need. Now let's talk about what this means practically, because understanding this concept intellectually is very different from actually applying it to your life. You don't necessarily need to vanish into the wilderness for 7 days to experience this shift, although if you can even once in your life, it is worth every uncomfortable moment. What matters most is understanding the deeper principle behind the experiment and beginning to apply small doses of intentional disappearance into your everyday existence. This might look like turning off your phone for an entire day each week with no explanation given to anyone. It might look like spending a weekend completely alone without filling the silence with music, television, or social media, simply sitting with your own thoughts until the discomfort passes and clarity begins to surface. It might mean stepping back from a relationship or friendship that only functions through constant contact to see what, if anything, remains when the noise fades. It might mean saying no to an invitation you would normally accept out of guilt just to prove to yourself that your identity does not depend on constant social performance. Each of these small acts of disappearance chips away at the same fear, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of being unnecessary, the fear that silence equals irrelevance. And each time you survive that discomfort without collapsing, you build what psychologists call self-concept clarity, a stronger, steadier sense of who you are, independent of outside reflection. This is the real gift hidden inside the 7-day disappearance experiment. It's not really about disappearing from others. It's about finally appearing fully and honestly to yourself. Because here is the deepest truth underlying everything we've discussed. Most people go their entire lives without ever truly meeting themselves. They are so busy managing how they're perceived, so occupied with maintaining relationships, careers, and appearances that they never pause long enough to ask who they actually are beneath all of that performance. And by the time silence finally arrives, often through loss, failure, or unavoidable isolation, it feels less like peace and more like confrontation because they are meeting a stranger they've been avoiding their whole life. You don't have to wait for life to force that silence upon you. You can choose it deliberately, consciously, on your own terms. And when you do, you take back an enormous amount of power the power to define your worth internally rather than borrowing it moment to moment from the reactions of others. So here's the real question you should walk away with today. Not whether the world would survive 7 days without you, because it would, and that is not a tragedy, it's a truth that sets you free. The real question is whether you could survive 7 days with only yourself for company and come back not feeling diminished, but restored. If the answer makes you uncomfortable, that discomfort is not a warning sign to avoid. It's a map pointing directly toward the growth you've been circling around for years. Disappear even briefly, not to punish the world for taking you for granted, and not to test who truly loves you, though you will learn that too. Disappear to remember who you are underneath everything you've built to be seen, because the version of you that exists in silence, unwitnessed and unapproved, is the most honest version you will ever meet. And once you meet that version of yourself, truly meet them, you will never again mistake being seen for being valuable or being busy for being important. You will simply live quietly certain of who you are, whether anyone is watching or not. If this made you see silence, solitude, or self-worth differently, take a moment to like this video, subscribe if you want more content like this, and tell me in the comments, could you actually disappear for 7 days? And what do you think you'd discover about yourself if you did? Then go watch the next video, because what we're about to explore next takes this idea even deeper into a truth about human validation you've probably never consciously realized about yourself.